From the thrilling pages of the DC comic,
faster than a speeding bullet,
a myth is forged.
more powerful than a locomotive,
A hero takes flight.
able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. This amazing stranger from the planet Krypton, the Man of Steel, Superman.
Welcome back to Superman Lives. I'm Chris.
And I'm Michael.
And we are very sorry that it has been this long. It's been since July, Michael, since we did an episode. Our last episode was about Superman, well, the Amazing Spider-Man versus Superman. And,
wow, that was our last episode.
That was our last episode way back. We did it to coincide with Spider-Man Homecoming. So, I'm
sure people probably thought we were just done. The podcast had quietly finished or something.
They might have, and I did not update the Facebook page. So anybody who's a faithful fan, hopefully they're going to see this, and they're still listening. We have had a busy time the last few months, both personally, but also both Michael and I endeavored to do a daily vlog during Halloween, a video blog. And it was very time-consuming, and
yes.
I being the person I am when it comes to, I always dream really big, and then realism comes in after. And I had this very elaborate plan that Michael can tell you about, where we were going to record a brief episode for every issue of the entire saga, which runs from. It started in, I think, in mid-October.
Of the Death of Superman.
Of the Death of Superman, correct. All the way until next year. We were going to do this once a week. And then I realized that's probably not going to happen. And just realistically, there was no way. We would have had to record many at a time. And so anyway, I decided, and we both decided that we would focus on the separate chapters of the story and give our impressions and discuss those. So this episode will cover the beginning of that story arc, which I'm going to just give you the breakdown, not of every issue, but you had a story arc that a lot of people don't really, I think, recall, because it didn't fully feature Doomsday. Doomsday was not even really known. I mean, this is pre-internet, so if you read the comics and you saw this fist at the end of the issue, you might have thought, what the hell is this? And it was in the solicits previews at the time, but it really wasn't something that circulated like it would now. It was 1992. And so the death of Superman was not really even planned originally, although it was not put together as a stunt. That's one of the things I want to dispel in this episode is, it was just a stunt to get money. It was the 90s. Everything was stunt-driven. No. It actually followed everything that had gone on since these guys took over from Byrne. And, Marv Wolfman kind of passed the torch to these guys, Roger Stern, Jerry Ordway, Louise Simonson, and, of course, Dan Jurgens eventually, Carl Kessel. All of these writers and wonderful artists did this unprecedented. I don't think it's ever been done since. They had a weekly Superman adventure. Every week you had a chapter, and they were different books, they were different writers, different artists, but each one continued this saga, the never-ending battle. And that was how they plugged it in various issues. And so Doomsday, ads for Doomsday is coming, began to show up in some of these earlier comics. So the way that DC breaks it down, if you look at all of the I guess, not just websites, but various comic book price guides, and I've been researched this for quite a while to figure out what do we call this section, because it's not just like it is in the trades. So the first section actually began with Doomsday is Coming, and that section was 4 issues, and that began on Sunday, September the 17th of 1992. That was Man of Steel number 17, and then that was the first of 4 issues. At the end of each, we saw this mysterious fist punching a wall, and didn't know really what it meant until October the 15th, 1992, when Doomsday first made his full appearance, Man of Steel 18, and then that 7-issue arc ended on Sunday. When you're listening to this, this will be out on this date, November 19th, 1992, with the release of Superman 75, and we're not spoiling anything, the death, of course, of Superman.
Yeah.
And so after that, of course, you had Funeral for a Friend. That ran from November 26th of 1992 all the way to January 21st of 1993. And we're going to talk about that in detail when we get to that benchmark, when we get to that anniversary. Then you had a time where there were no regular issues being published, which really, especially for me, because I was still kind of a novice when it came to comic book storytelling tropes, I guess, or practices. These books that filled these weeks, it really seemed to suggest that Superman was really dead and that the books had been canceled, and I didn't know better. So you had the Legacy of Superman. You had Superman and Supergirl and Team Luthor, News Time, which is the Time magazine of the DC Universe, The Life and Death of Superman. And all of that really went until Friday, March 16th of 1993, and then that was it for another month. And then Adventures of Superman 500 hit, and that is the one that mirrored the all-black cover. It had the all-white cover, and that we were to take meant that Superman was back. And you had the Reign of the Supermen, which went all the way through June 3rd, 1993, and then the Return of Superman began on June 10th, 1993, and everything ended. Superman back with long hair, not a mullet. That story finally ran its logical course and kind of ended with a wonderful issue calling back to Funeral for a Friend, but it was a memoriam for Coast City, and that was September 23rd, 1993. So 25 years. And I'm just shocked by that. And so before we get into talking about our memories of it for the first time, this was not the plan to kill Superman, although it had been teased in the writer's room because they would have a yearly Superman summit, and all these guys, and Louise Simonson, I don't want to be sexist, and when I say guys, I include her, they all always joked when they kind of hit a roadblock narratively, well, let's just kill him. And they wanted to do the wedding. So they had Superman, or I should say Clark and Lois, already engaged. And, of course, by this time, Clark had revealed his secret identity. That came after the engagement, which is a little weird. But they wanted to do the wedding, and then this little TV show, Lois and Clark, New Adventures of Superman, came along, and Warner Brothers said, you're not doing it in your comic until we do it in the TV show, which to me, it should be the other way around, but it shows you how the studios thought at the time. And so they said, well, we got to do something to fill it in. We're going to kill Superman. And here we are 25 years later. So
I'd also like to say, briefly add to that, if you have never heard of this individual by the name of Max Landis, this little millennial upstart with a completely unearned sense of accomplishment, did a YouTube video on how stupid the death of Superman was, and he tries to paint the whole thing as though it was just a stunt and blah blah blah, and just it's completely untrue. Everything's like you said. That, it had always been sort of a joke, and it's another event in a comic book. Every event they hope to make money on. So I mean, like, what's the problem that they were hoping to sell titles? I mean, that's not automatic, reason to criticize it. But I did want to just add too that the writers refused to touch this, and they would not do it without Jerry Siegel's approval. And Jerry Siegel did give his blessing, and it was always understood that. And we'll talk about this when we get into memories and stuff like that too. But this is Superman is such a Christ character, a Hercules character, all of these kind of characters that these kinds of gods in culture and mythology, they need to die and they need to be resurrected. That's just part of the story arc. And it was, I think people just realized it was time for that element of the story to take place,
That's right, because with the post-crisis Superman, and without getting too deep into this, and for those who maybe aren't familiar with the eras, this was a rebooted version of Superman from 1986. So this version of Superman really took many, many milestones that never could have happened before 1986 because there was always a status quo that kind of had to be kept, a reset. So you had a lot of imaginary stories. You had the multiverse where things could happen. But in the main DCU, Superman was not going to really marry Lois Lane. Just wasn't going to stick. It wasn't going to happen. Here, though, it could happen. Here, though, the Kents were still alive. There were a lot of things that had never been allowed to happen permanently that could happen here at this time, and it was definitely the logical progression, because if we can marry him, then we can also, what is death going to mean for Superman? And that was definitely one of the themes they wanted to explore, and we thankfully now in the modern comics have gone beyond just the two of them being married. Superman and Lois, of course, now have John, so childhood or parenthood for them is kind of that next progression. And and as you point out, I think it's very important to understand too, this was 1992. So if you look at the era, we're talking about Image Comics. We're talking about a still very dark, not as dark as, say, the mid-'80s, but we're still talking about a very dark culture as far as movies. Terminator was big that year. A lot of violent, the ultra-violence of the 80s kind of starting to wane somewhat, but you still had Tarantino coming into his own. And so the Image Comics were very violent. The character of Spawn, extremely violent, a guy who is a murderer as a quote-unquote superhero. And here, Superman had been really considered to be just kind of antiquated, and he was a big blue Boy Scout. And Superman, the titles were not, as some, I think it became kind of a legend of sorts that, nobody likes Superman anymore, the books were about to be canceled. No, but the sales were not where they wanted them, and the character hadn't really been in the consciousness outside of the Superman, the Christopher Reeve films, which by 86 were done with Superman 4. So part of the reason this story was told, once the decision was made, we're going to kill him, the impetus became, we are going to show why Superman still matters amidst this dark era, the grim and gritty era, the post-Watchmen, post-Dark Knight world. And that is what I love most about this story, is what it says about Superman, and we, of course, and heroes, and we're going to talk about that in detail later. Anything you want to touch on before we get to our memories?
Well, just, you're talking about the time period and how there was a lot of darkness going on in the comics and whatnot. I do remember, of course, the Tim Burton Batman film had come out in 89. So, not too terribly long before this. And then Batman Returns and such. And I remember, we both love that film and we both are Batman fans. But I remember that a lot of people reacting to the movie, I would see that on TV or our Hero Reviews or whatever. They felt the need to slam Superman in saying how cool the Batman movie was. And it was like, now we finally got a hero who's a little more relatable. He's not this untouchable, this overpowered, can do anything and always does, the right thing. Now we have just a human, now we have a real hero that we can. So I think in addition to the darkness, there was this complete and total silly misunderstanding of a hero needs to be, has to be human, has to be just like us, can't be this or that, and like a misunderstanding of what Superman is and how he relates to us more than any other character, really. But that was in the air too, I think, just to mention it.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and Batman Fever was so immersive after. I mean, you really couldn't get away from it. Which, as you said, we're both huge Batman fans and love the character, but it was, and DC, of course, as they've been doing for the last few years, they tried to squeeze every ounce of money as they could. That's not a criticism because they are a business, but at the same time, I think they probably went overboard. But yeah, there was that sense, and as we're going to talk about when we get to memories, I was kind of in that boat of not really being familiar with Superman in the comics, only from the Christopher Reeve movies for many years. I had not been reading the newer comics at the time, and so I really liked Batman and got into comics regularly because of Batman '89, and so I had some of that myself, but we'll talk about that. So what are your memories of reading this the first time? I know in the past you've said there was a personal connection to this time in your life and the story, so of course I don't want you to share anything you don't want to, but I'm thinking of a different time. I don't remember.
No, I mean, this was the time. Certainly, the Man of Steel film coming out was a big time too, tied to my own relationship with the character, but if not in a good way in that sense. But
Right.
no, this was I was young. I was a little younger than you. So probably 13, 14, something like that, I think.
Okay.
And I think, is that about the time? Yeah.
Yeah, because I would have been, in 92, I would have been 16 probably.
Yeah, something like that. But like you, the Batman film had gotten me into Batman comics. So I was following Batman comics. Now, I had always dearly loved Superman from the Christopher Reeve films growing up, and he was always a special character to me from that incarnation. But I would try to get into the Superman comics a little bit. But Superman is a hard title to jump into cold, unless you know, if you don't really know a lot about the DC universe in general, or you haven't really followed the stories. At that point, they were kind of telling longer arcs, so you just grab a single issue, and a lot of things you weren't sure about what was going on. So whenever I would grab a Superman comic, it just really wouldn't grip me. I would go back and read some of the Silver Age stories or some of the standalone stuff that was fun. But when the death of Superman was announced, the first thing that struck me was how the entire society just immediately revolted. And it was such a cool notion that, supposedly this is a world that doesn't care about Superman anymore. But the second you reveal that, okay, now we're killing him off, no, you can't take him away from us. We might not have been using him, we might not have been spending any time with him, but you cannot take that away from us. And that was, I think, a very telling response by a lot of people in general, just, people who don't necessarily read comics at all. And of course, they didn't realize that DC was never really intending to kill him off forever or something like that. But that was pretty powerful then. And for me personally, not knowing much about what they were intending, it was I shared that reaction. It was, how can you? No, you can't take him away. It was very much a I don't know. And I definitely wanted to find out, and I definitely wanted to read. It's kind of like suddenly I wanted to spend as much time with this character in the comics as I could, feeling like they were going to take him away from me. I definitely have more of a reactions of reading it and stuff. I don't know if you want to go there just yet, or to give yours about hearing it first. Or
Yeah, for me, this was pre-internet, so the only way that we really learned about anything was in print in some way. I read a magazine called Comic Scene. I don't know if you remember reading Comic Scene.
Oh, yeah.
And that was just a fantastic book. But I don't think I'd gotten into Comic Scene, or I probably had one or two, and they were all about Batman or the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which had come out, that movie had come out 2 years prior. So I don't know that there was anything about the death of Superman that I noticed in there. I know there was, I just didn't see that issue. My uncle, of all people, and my family always supportive of the hobby, brought me a newspaper clipping. How quaint. And it was about the death of Superman, and he told me, well, they're killing off Superman. And I remember thinking that at the time, because I had gone through a pretty dark patch in middle school, high school, and so this for me would have been sophomore year. So I was still kind of in a dark place. I liked dark stuff, and I had gotten into comics regularly because of Batman. Anything Batman, but then also I got into Marvel by way of that. Then The Flash slowly began to comics were so cheap then that I could really read so much, and I was able to kind of cross over. But more I read about DC, the more I loved. And I grew up, my brother had DC comics primarily, and I always looked through them, and I was always fascinated by that world. There was something about that universe, those characters, and of course, like you, grew up with Christopher Reeve Superman, loved the character. But I think by that time I was really into the dark stuff, and the memory I had of Superman from a comic at that point was in A Lonely Place of Dying, which, to put that on a timeline, was 1988. So a number of years before the death of Superman. And the only thing I remembered about that version in the comics of Superman was Jason Todd has been murdered by the Joker, Robin, and Superman flies in and says, hey, Bruce, you can't do anything because he has diplomatic immunity, and Batman punches him. And I remember just thinking the way he was portrayed in that book did not endear him to me. Now, that was the only version of Superman I had read up to that point, besides, some Bronze Age stuff that my brother had. So that was a fair kind of judgment, because it was kind of written, unfortunately, for him to seem that way. I think a better writer who maybe liked the character more Nothing against Jim Starlin, but I think that somebody else would have said, well, let's make this a little more brotherly, instead of having it come off as I'm the big cop coming in to tell you what you can't do. And of course, Batman hauls off and punches him, and he tells him, you could have broken all the fingers in your hand. But then the next time I saw Superman, I really began to like the character because he was racing Wally West, and I was reading the Wally West Flash stories series on a regular basis. Got that news clipping and was into Spawn, was into Wolverine, was into some dark stuff, and I actually thought, well, I kind of can understand why they would kill him off, because it seems to me he just isn't that popular anymore. Little did I know that like you said, that was never even a plan that DC had. And so like you, I really felt, gosh, I can't believe they're going to do this, because I still had pleasant childhood memories of the character. I was, when you get into something, and as an OCD person, I go all in on something. So I was all in these new characters and Batman and the dark, cool, goth stuff. And so I kind of thought, well, Superman's just kind of lame, but I didn't really know Superman. And thankfully, this story, I think, was designed for me and for people like me who, hey, let's get these people to read this book, because otherwise they may never. And I think it really hooked a number of people, an entire generation perhaps, on Superman as a result.
Yeah.
So that's how I found out about it. And then I was going to the comic shop, 2 of them, and I went to both of them by this point and asked, can I get these? And was told by both comic book shop owners, oh, it's too late. We've already sold out the pre-orders, and there's no way. So I was heartbroken, because I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to read these. And there was a collection coming out of trade, and I thought, I guess that's the same, but I really wanted those issues. And so I'll talk more about the memories of reading them for the first time. But you go ahead and start us off with that experience. What was that like? Did you read those as they came out, each issue, or did you read them together?
I didn't. I read the entirety of the story in a trade. I did get a couple of the issues coming out, but for me it was. I can't really talk about this without making connections to Superman as a Christ-like character, and I know that some people just lose their minds about that, and it's unfair to reduce him to only a Christ-like character, because there's many other elements and archetypes within him. But it's just as an unfair reduction to pretend that that's not there, and it very much is, especially in Western culture. The Christ-like character is such a central part of culture and mythology for the Western civilization that you can't ignore that in Superman's. And for me, in my own experience growing up in the church and everything, Superman became more of a sort of a fatherly, godly type character. It's interesting that you brought up that moment in Death in a Family, and I totally understand your reaction to that. I actually had a different one, though. For me, it was kind of like, and this wasn't a fair representation of Superman either, really, in total, but it was sort of like God stepped in and stopped Batman from doing something he would regret. I remember little things like they were in the court scene, and I think the Joker had set off poison or something like that, and all of a sudden Batman was dressed as a bailiff, I believe, and he just inhales all of the poison and just takes it all into himself so no one else is hurt. And that's very self-sacrificial, even though it's not going to hurt him. But I remember Batman kind of being in awe of that. It was like this, suddenly this higher power has come to kind of help things along, whereas Batman couldn't have done much. And that's a Batman story where he's human, he's got his gadgets, but it's only so much you can do in that situation. And then I remember when Batman punched him, and Superman said something like, "If I hadn't rolled with that punch, you would have broken your hand or whatever." And I just remember thinking he was. I totally get the reaction of him being kind of a jerk there. I do. At the time, for whatever reason, I kind of took that though as he was just being sort of patient, and it wasn't a fun thing to have to come and tell somebody who had suffered that loss that, hey, you still need to calm down. You can't take vengeance. You can't kill him. But at the same time, it was I don't know. I was just a little inspired by that. But it's still like an untouchable type of character. It's still, so overpowered and so, wise and stuff like that. So then reading The Death of Superman and reading the story, I couldn't help but to have the same reaction to it that I would growing up going to Passion plays around Easter time. Plays where it's the last days of Christ and then the crucifixion, and then they would end with the resurrection. But each year when it comes around and you go to these plays, if you go to a good one, especially as a child, and if you grow up in that Christian mindset, with those beliefs, it's a little harrowing. I mean, this is long before Mel Gibson's film came out, of course, but it's still, you're seeing this character on stage, but it's a representation of a person that you actually believe in and actually believe you're spending time with and such. And it's really hard to watch all these horrible things happen to this character. Not so much that, or not just rather that he's going through all of these sufferings and all these horrible things are happening to them, but the whole, in the Christian theology, the whole time you're watching it, you're also realizing how much you haven't measured up and how much you haven't, really done all you could during the year and such. And I had something like that experience reading The Death of Superman. He's taking on all of this punishment to save people. He's trying to, Doomsday would be out, destroying the world. So Superman says, no, fight me instead, destroy me if anything, and he's trying to stop him. And I thought that's just that really impressed me. It was so amazing, and I hated that happening to Superman. At the same time, it was kind of I felt a little guilty, not having followed the character in the comic books. I didn't understand when they say the Justice League is coming in. I'm like, who are these guys? That wasn't the Justice League in the in the 90s. And then Supergirl shows up, and I'm like, what? Why is she with Lex? What is because I didn't understand that continuity at the time, and I just felt it was. I felt like the kid, going to a passion play and realizing, wow, I haven't read my Bible all year or something like that. And that seems kind of silly, but that's the importance that Superman has to people. Not that he's your god, not that anything like that, but he's a character that inspires you in a similar way and can inspire a type of loyalty too, I think. So that's just the start of my my reaction to it there.
Oh, these bony protrusions erupting from his skin. He got me. I must take him down. Everybody stand back! If those bones are extensions of a skeleton, let's try this! Yes, I hurt him this time!
Jimmy, I can't look! I can't!
Lois, forgive me! I have to shoot this! It's gonna end in seconds! It has to! This is it. We're both betting everything we got on this one.
Like weary boxers who have gone the distance, the combatants collided in one last explosive effort. In the years to come, a few witnesses will tell of the power of these punches, that they could literally feel the shockwaves. Others will remember the enormous crater that resulted from the sheer force of the blows. Most will remember this sad day as that on which the proudest, most noble man they ever knew finally fell. But for those who would be his friend, those who would call him son, those who loved him, it is too late. Please hang on! The paramedics will be here any second!
Doomsday. Is he?
You stopped him. You saved us all. Now be still until... No. Oh, no. No!
Yeah, well, I actually had the similar one, and I always feel like these characters, for me, growing up, a resentment that I had and a struggle that I had was I did not learn a lot of the moral truths I should have learned from my parents. And characters like Superman, the growing up watching the Christopher Reeve movies, understanding that this guy was a good guy on a very simple but profound level as a kid, and then growing up and continuing to watch those, understanding who the good guys were, what made them the good guys, and then that going as far as Superman, Star Wars, as far as Star Trek, as far as Optimus Prime, who was another guy who was larger than life and the leader and always did the right thing. And these were the characters that I got my morality from, my sense of morality, and of course my faith as well. But I think when I started reading comics, my faith was not something I was all that really interested in. I still kind of looked at it as, nah, okay, because I was a cradle Catholic, etc. But this was the genius way to get me to think about moral things and being good, because I freaking love comic books, and superheroes. And so for me, as I sat there, so what happened with me was, here I go thinking, I'm not going to read these. And then on Christmas night, or Christmas Day, 1992, my mom gives me a dress shirt box, those flimsy boxes. And I open it up, and on the top of it is the trade paperback of The Death of Superman. And then underneath is a first print of each issue. So I didn't think at all that I would see any first prints. I really didn't, because by now my comic shop owner kept saying, they're going to go to third print and fourth print and blah blah blah, and they're super expensive. There was no eBay, but to get a copy of Superman 75 is going to be hundreds of dollars. And there was that speculator boom that did happen. But my mom had actually gone and somehow got the first prints. So I went in my room, and I can remember going in my room, and I sat there and I read the trade, and then I read each individual issue very reverently, very carefully, again. So I read the story twice through, and I was shocked by much of what you're saying. Here is a character who is he's being beaten to death savagely. And I had never seen that with Superman. I mean, we saw a little bit of it in Superman 2. I don't think I had ever seen a comic book battle quite that vicious, where the hero was getting that kind of punishment, of damage. Usually the hero, and I was also into the Punisher, there was a lot of anti-heroes meeting out this horrible damage, but they weren't receiving it. And here is Superman being beaten, and every moment when you read this story, you notice that there is always a scene at some point where he is poised to have to save someone else, and it is his first priority. It's the only priority. And I love the character of Mitch, who in the Death of Superman arc is this punk kid who you instantly don't like, because he's so mean to his mom. He's like, I can understand why Dad left and wants a divorce. What a jerk, this kid, And yet, what was genius about the character was he was the comic book reader of the time. He was the cynic who, in the comic, says, Superman's an idiot, and Guy Gardner's the cooler guy. And of course, Guy Gardner was the hard case at the time. He wore the leather jacket and all this. And Superman never stoops to any of the criticisms. He never gives in to any of that. I read it again today. I was rereading one of those issues, and here is Doomsday punching Superman for the first time, their first face-to-face meeting, and Mitch's mom says he took a punch that could have leveled a mountain and it didn't even budge. And then Mitch says he was too stupid and slow to move. And I thought, Superman heard you say that, dude, and he's getting his ass kicked for you and your mom, you little ingrate. And and it was such a genius move. The idea that this would be one of the many ways where they really explored throughout this whole story, all three sections of it. What does Superman mean? What makes him who he is and what he is, both in in a meta way and also within the DC universe. So it was very much I don't want to say a conversion, but it was very much a point in my life, my sophomore year in high school, where I was getting into my faith, where I was beginning to soften, I think, in a lot of ways. I was not, because I had a lot of anger, and those darker characters really do give you that catharsis. But Superman, as I read it, I thought, this guy is taking this punishment, and he's laying his life down. I mean, that was my exact thought. And reading Superman 75, I really thought, I can't believe this is over. And like you, I had a similar feeling and thought, which was, now I love this guy, and he's dead. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is it. Like, because I really believe, done. And so when I put that down, Superman 75, having read those through twice in one sitting, I was just heartbroken. And I went and looked at my brother's old stuff and thought, I guess this is it. Like, I mean, there's no more Superman. And after that, all of the Superman titles added to my pull list. So I was there for the funeral for a friend, and I went every week. I was old enough now to drive around that time, and every Friday and eventually Wednesday, I was there following that whole story, and it was always at the top of my list. And still today, Superman at the top of the reading pile. So that was my memories of reading it for the first time, and 25 years later, I have read it at least once a year. I don't always get through every part of it, but I try to at least get through a section, whether it's just the death. And that's another thing I want us to talk about, that there's a great criticism that, the death of Superman was a terrible, gimmicky, empty story because it's just a slugfest for 7 issues. That's like saying Star Wars is just about aerial battles. That's one section of an overall story, right? Yeah. It's just about lightsabers clashing. Well, were you listening to the dialogue? Did you watch what that set up? And in the same way, you had to have this section. It had to kind of be... and I think a lot of people also had preconceived notions. Well, Lex Luthor will kill Superman. Well, of course, that would have been expected. That wouldn't have been new. It happened in the comics in the 60s anyway. There was the imaginary story, the original Death of Superman. So this, to me, was genius in every way that they could have done this. They did such a nuanced and it... What floors me about all of these guys, Dan Jurgens, Jerry Ordway, Roger Stern, Louise Simonson, John Bogdanove, Tom Grummett, all the creators, writers and artists, they loved Superman. And you saw that. Yeah. I mean, you couldn't have written this without it. And I want to recommend this to any of our listeners who's never seen it. On the lackluster Superman Doomsday DVD film, there's a fantastic documentary. And Louise Simonson, who wrote Man of Steel, not the movie, the comic, she's crying about the wonderful scenes that she wrote of Jonathan and Martha burying Clark's personal belongings, which we'll talk more about when we cover the funeral for a friend arc. Yeah. But these guys loved it, and they grew up with Superman, and they were the ones. It happened the timing was so right. I really kind of dread to think what would have happened if it had been 2011, and they were like, let's kill Superman. Oh my God. They kind of did in a way. I mean, they got rid of him, but so I kind of think that covers certainly what it means to us. But is there anything else you want to say about what the story means for you over the years? If it's meant anything else?
I liked what you were saying too, and I had a similar experience where this is a character who really steps in and teaches you a lot about moral behavior, and for me specifically, it was self-control. Growing up with examples I didn't always have a great example of controlling your anger or controlling your whatever that first emotion is that you're going to react with, and in this Doomsday story in particular, Superman takes a while before he realizes he can really use full force against Doomsday. I mean, at first, as with any other villain, he's trying to save Doomsday from himself as much as he's trying to save people from Doomsday. He's not out to kill, out to stop or whatever. And as he keeps throwing more at Doomsday and it's not working, I mean, he eventually realizes he can just, this is a villain that can take anything he can dish out. So that's where you have that wonderful moment where it's not Doomsday kills Superman. It's the fact that Superman has to realize that he's giving all he can, and they both hit each other that hard. I mean, so and he does stop Doomsday, and his Superman's own death is stopping the threat, which is great. So just that idea of him working up to that point, whereas so many other characters, would have immediately launched into, some more lethal attempt or something like that. So I really thought that was a great lesson throughout the book too, just to see that how he keeps his head about all of this stuff as much as the carnage is going on. And he's starting to worry about if he's going to be able to stop him and stuff, but he never stops trying and always, and does find the way in the end, even though it's a tragic ending. That was really, really something. And I'd also like to say that too, that, we're talking about how you mentioned Mitch, wonderful character and a great little meta kind of critique on society. But society keeps doing this with Superman. They did it here in this case where, Superman, whatever, overpowered. What, you're going to kill him? No, you can't take him from us. It happened again with 9/11. I remember that. I don't know if I've mentioned this before in the podcast, but they were starting to announce Smallville and that show that was going to be up, and they were just kind of teasing some things they were going to do with it and everything. And they, I think they released the image. I think the first image of Tom Welling in that first episode where they tied him to the Scarecrow pole and he has the S on his chest and stuff. And people were saying, this is so hokey. We do not need we don't need another Superman story right now. Oh my gosh, this is so. Then 9/11 happened, and almost overnight, you had reviewers coming saying, we need this show. We need Superman right now. We need hope, And not that, there were far bigger things after 9/11 to write about too, but this was the thing that was being written about in terms of that show. So it just we keep having this over and over again, and we've even seen it most recently with this Justice League film. As much as they tried to deconstruct Superman, and now they're trying to just pretend that didn't happen, and now he's always been full of hope. And it's people don't know how to keep on that hope train or keep on that wonderful inspiration that Superman provides. Society as a whole, anyway. And an event like the death of Superman is really pivotal and monumental in his history to really show that and show what he can mean to people year round if they let him.
Absolutely. And I think, as you say that, there's a connection between, for me, of as we consider ourselves more adult and more mature, because I've heard people talk about this. In fact, Patton Oswalt was talking to Jerry Seinfeld on Jerry's Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, and Patton Oswalt says to Jerry, as I get older, I identify with Spider-Man more, and which is interesting because you'd think it'd be the reverse. But Jerry was surprised by that because, of course, as we know, huge Superman fan. And I think as we age and become more mature, we find we have less use for Superman or a character like him because, that's just for kids. And that kind of black and white moral approach where, you can be good for the sake of being good and do what's right because it's the right thing to do. That's just how kids see the world. We become, and I know for me that was exactly what it was, because I was looking at things in this kind of, I'm mature and I know all of this. And that story really, I think, awoke me to the reality that it put me in touch again with that part of me that we all have, that is a child, I think, unabashedly loves Superman because they understand the pure nature of it is the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do, and you can be good, and it is something we're all capable of doing. And I think that's what we lose touch with, and that's why every time I answer a criticism about these horrible movies, or I'm making the criticism about the Snyder stuff, I always point out the deconstruction. These are some pretty depressed guys. I mean, you don't turn Superman into what we see in those films unless you've got some serious psychological issues. And I'm not presuming to know what those guys have gone through. Certainly Zack Snyder's had a horrible tragedy, but that's very telling about their own psyche and their own personality, that you can't even let a fictional character be what it is and stand for what any kid in the world sees that symbol and know what it stands for and is empowered by it. They put the towel around their neck and they're Superman, and they're not Superman going break somebody's neck. They're Superman helping. It's so instinctual. It's so primal. So absolutely. I mean, I think that's very much tied into this idea that society doesn't realize what it has until it's gone. And I mean, this was far-reaching. Saturday Night Live did that wonderful Death of Superman funeral skit, which was not done for laughs. And I'm going to put this up. I'll link it in the show notes for this episode. There was no attempt at making it funny. I mean, yes, you have Black Lightning, who is at the funeral, and nobody knows him, even though Batman should, because he was in The Outsiders, which I remember thinking, watching it, I know who The Outsiders are. I'd read the comic by then. But that was the only humor. Everything else was pretty sincere and heartfelt and sad. You have Phil Hartman as Perry White, and they're all sad over the loss of Superman. So I think that's very telling about the culture as well.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say before we get into what we feel it says and continues to say about Superman? We kind of touched on some of that.
Yeah. No. I think that's pretty much it for me in my experience reading it. Yeah.
Yeah. I also noticed, and this is something that I also realize is a design of the story, but as I've reread it over the years, I have noticed, especially with The Funeral for a Friend, which we're going to get into in more depth in a few weeks. This story really quickly goes from showing us how certain people see Superman, how the Justice League of the time, which I don't want to say they were a joke, but they were not the Big Seven that we know. They weren't the iconic Justice League, yet they had a tremendous respect for him. And I love how people are criticizing the Justice League, Cat Grant, in the beginning of this story, and Superman's always defending them. He's always just very... some people would say he's clean and Boy Scout, but he's always very gentle and respectful, and I just love that. Again, reading part of it today, picked up on that again, how he never criticizes these guys. And I mean, yeah, they were the blah-ha-ha Justice League at the time. They were there for laughs, but he respected them. And yet, once we move into Funeral for a Friend, we're seeing another meta commentary on how the world was reacting to the death of Superman. Because now, at this point, the writers of this arc have seen it happen in the real world. So now we're seeing how the entire DCU, the entire world, sees the loss of this man, of Superman. And, of course, we even have the Clintons there talking at the funeral. So it's just really... on so many levels, it's just such a powerful story, and I feel like if only there are certain people who read it or won't read it, and they maybe it's just they're never going to get it. I don't know, but if they could just go with the through line, what will this tell me about this character and his place in the DCU? Because we've seen the DCU when Superman is not considered important. We saw it almost really 10 years before the New 52. We see it now in the Snyder movies. And here, this whole story was about bringing Superman back. And I love, and again, this will be something we talk about in Reign, I love that when Superman comes back, he's inspired a whole new group of heroes, right? That even in dying, he's managed to make people better and inspire other people to take up the shield. So it's just a tremendous story in that regard, and we'll break some of that down as we go. Anything else you want to?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll say more about this when we get to Funeral for a Friend and such, but the notion too that as you see everybody's reaction to his death, and especially in Funeral of a Friend, it inspires you to go back and read, at least inspired me anyway, to go back and read those stories that I've missed, because that was earned. That reaction they had, and that sense of great loss, and the pain and the suffering and the hole that he left was earned because of all that he did while he was alive. Because of all of his actions and all of the examples that he set. And you just can't. It's just so culturally close right now. You can't not mention the Snyder films, because now in Justice League, they've tried to just slap a fix on Superman. Apparently, I've read the reviews. Now, oh no, you're having an opening scene, and now he's happy and he talks about hope a lot. It's not earned. It doesn't work. That's not how inspiration works. That's not how hope works. You can't just pretend that somebody earned that kind of response in their life when you didn't show it. You didn't. They didn't do anything to actually deserve that. In all the previous films or all the previous stories or whatever. It's the same thing about when somebody passes away in real life that maybe you didn't really think much of because of their behavior or whatever. Of course, you don't want to speak ill of the dead, and you're not going to trash them, but it's kind of some of the nice things people tend to say about them in mourning or whatever sort of rings hollow a little bit, in your mind. And that's kind of what it was. But this was not the case for the event in the comics, because you really could go back and see all these wonderful times where he's really lighting the way to a better tomorrow.
Absolutely. And people who, there are even scenes where there are people who are his enemies, except for Lex, who is just upset that he didn't get to kill him. There are people who really mourn his loss because they even were touched by him. His enemies, Guy Gardner, who they never got along at the time, is touched by his loss as well. And I really think that everything that we see in this story is almost, if you had said, we're doing another reboot right after the death of Superman, you could almost see it as the culmination, because I hadn't read all of those. Like you, I started to go back and fill in the blanks here and there, and I still haven't. I would love, that's, if DC doesn't do exactly what I want them to do, this is my demand letter, my ultimatum, that they're not listening to or reading. But I sometimes I just dream of going back and just focusing on all the back issues from '86 until 2011, and It's not something that's going to happen. But there's such a rich history. They really developed him beyond anything that had been seen before '86. Clark. They got into his relationship with the Kents. They just added so many layers. You had 2 full miniseries, or 3: the world of Smallville, the world of Krypton, the world of Metropolis. We knew about his grandparents. It was just really tremendous. And okay, Siri thought I was talking to her. Shut up, Siri. And so it all just naturally progressed. And that's another reason I hate the criticism. They just did this as a gimmick. No, there was an extension. I mean, I can remember a lot of people, when I was reading this, there were guys at the comic shop, and I'm a kid and they're much older, saying, oh, well, you know who this Doomsday guy is? He was in... Brainiac made him. He's one of the characters in Panic from the Sky, and I didn't know what the hell that was. And of course, I went back and read Panic from the Sky, and that was a prevailing theory that this was some kind of Brainiac creation. So what that tells us is there's been such great storytelling and such nuanced stuff going on and being laid down that it really opened a lot of people to just infer what they wanted to, or assume, well, hey, this is where he came from and what his purpose is. So we could talk for hours. I mean, we really could.
Sure.
Just continue to go on. But what I know Michael and I will both agree on is, if you've never read it, for whatever reason, if you've heard negative press, if you will, if you've heard it's been bashed, if you have been misguidedly under the assumption that, the way it was done in the movie is better. No. And by the movie, I mean Batman v Superman. That's not the death of Superman.
No.
The animated movie pales in comparison. Thankfully, we're going to be getting a 2-part story that's going to be faithful, coming, I think, next year. So go and read it. It is all on Comixology. And last year, at the beginning of this year, I think, DC re-released all of the trades with a nice new trade dress, so that when you put them on your bookcase, there's a nice red S on a black background that forms along the spine, and it's really nicely done. You can also get the omnibus, which I bought last year for $100. It's now almost $200, so I think with the 25th anniversary, they're not reprinting it, which I'm very surprised by. But go in some way, read it. You can find reprints or third or fourth printings for pretty cheap. In your local comic shop or online or eBay. So we highly recommend that you read it. And of course, if you haven't and you're listening, we're going to spoil a great deal. The other thing I just want to touch on is, before we go, that scene in Superman 75, that whole issue, it's a genius thing that a lot of people maybe don't realize is happening. Every issue is counting down to 75 by having fewer panels. So you start, I think, with 9, and then you go maybe to 8, and then you go to I don't remember the exact numbering. When we get to Superman 75, every page is a full page spread, which was just a genius idea because it speeds up the reading of the story. So as the action goes faster, you're going faster.
But it also slows down the event of the story too.
That's right, yeah, because it kind of drags it out. It puts it in kind of slow motion in a way. And when you look at that issue, you see some of those moments as they're happening, and it's just, they're almost frozen in time. You certainly don't. I didn't want it, because by that point I was converted, so I didn't want Superman to die. And two scenes in Superman 75 really still kind of choke me up when I read them. When Clark tells Lois, "I'll love you always," and he's saying goodbye on the rooftop, that is huge. And then when he has defeated Doomsday, they both fall to the ground. Doomsday dead, we'll just say for now, and Superman falls, and you have that wonderful Pieta image with Lois holding Superman, and his only concern is, did I stop Doomsday? Is the city safe? And powerful stuff. I mean, that, like you said, that it doesn't get more mythic and iconic than that. So it had the full page fold out, and just so well done. The other thing that I don't think is a marketing gimmick, no other comic ever had in comic book history that I know of, had a morning armband in it. So if you bought the Superman 75 gift set, as it was called, you got the obituary, Superman's obituary. You got stamps, which it was 1992. What are you going to do? You got a poster, but then you got the mourning armband, and it was so cool because everybody in the comic wore it at the funeral. So it was like you were there. Just really nice touch. So go out and read this, kids. And we'd love to get your feelings. Let us know in the comments there, here on YouTube or on Facebook on the Superman Lives page. And we are gonna, as I said, we're next in a few weeks. We're following the story. So Superman 75 25th anniversary this Sunday, which is when this comes out, and then Funeral for a Friend we will cover at the end of that, and so forth throughout the rest of the stories there. So there's going to be a lapse in there. We'll break up the Reign of the Superman as we go. We'll do certain issues throughout. So that's all I've got. Michael, any other recommendations or thoughts? Do you want to?
No, I think that covers it. Definitely go read it if you haven't experienced it. It's something that every Superman fan should have really read once. It's it's powerful.
And don't believe the negative hype, especially from Max Landis, who, he's got one decent movie under his belt. I don't know did you ever see? It was so decent, I forgot the name of it.
I know exactly.
That's a shame, isn't it? It's a pretty good movie. I mean, it's got Dane DeHaan in it from whatever movies he's in.
But it's always funny when the screenwriter of a film's like, "Yeah, that's my movie. You wrote the script, dude.
Yeah, exactly.
You didn't direct it. You didn't produce it.
No,
that's like the lowest rung on the totem pole.
That's right. And by the time they're done with it, how much of it is still yours? Yeah. He's just the arrogance of it, you know. But don't listen to this guy, and don't listen to any of these millennial neckbeards who tell you they know this story when they probably have never read it. They've read somebody's review of it, you know, while probably just stroking their copy of Watchmen in the corner. All right, this is getting weird now. Stroking Watchmen. I don't know what's happening. So we're going to wrap it up there, kids. Thanks so much for listening, and we hope you will take this time today on the 25th anniversary of the death of Superman to read, even if it's just Superman 75, read that story and share it with somebody else. And this is a podcast called Superman Lives, and he still does. He does get better, so don't think like we did, this is the end. So until next time, keep looking up because Superman lives. Superman Lives can be found on YouTube, iTunes, the Superman Podcast Network at supermanpodcastnetwork.com, and on the podcast's Facebook page, Superman Lives Podcast. Send feedback, suggestions, and questions to hosts Chris Moe and Michael Kreitzer at supermanlivespodcast@gmail.com. All music featured in the Superman Lives broadcast is the intellectual property of Warner Brothers. Superman and all related characters are the intellectual property of DC Comics, a division of DC Entertainment. Superman Lives is intended solely for the purpose of entertainment and does not in any way profit from its production or content. Superman Lives is a production of Big Show Studios and Iconic Superman on Facebook.